This lecture is about the scientific method. And I've said in other lectures that science is considered to be epistemically superior to non-science. That is, when we use science to gather knowledge, information about the natural world, that knowledge that's gathered through science is much more reliable. We have a higher confidence that we're on the right track. Maybe we're actually getting close to the truth if we use science rather than relying on sort of personal common sense or folklore or any of those kinds of options. So science is epistemically superior to non-science. So scientists and philosophers of science for a long period of time, decades, or even going back hundreds of years, they've tried to identify what it is that makes science better, epistemically speaking, epistemically superior to non-science. And the thought is that there's a specific method that scientists use to establish their knowledge about the natural world. And that method is different than what goes on in the non-science kinds of investigations. And so there were a variety of philosophers of science that were trying to identify and articulate what is that specific scientific method. In fact, if you look at a lot of introductory science textbooks, in the first chapter, they might have a section on the scientific method. And they say, this is the method that scientists use, and that's what distinguishes science from non-science. And so that's the topic that Carol Cleland here is investigating. Is there a single scientific method? And interestingly, those authors from the past that were trying to identify the singular scientific method, they were mainly focusing on physics and chemistry as kind of the standards for science. And that makes sense. Those are some of the oldest sciences. A lot of very reliable, useful knowledge had been gathered from those fields of research. So the thought was, let's look at what's going on in those areas of research, and so that we can identify the specific methods that are there. And that will be the scientific method that scientists are supposed to be following. So here's some of the common features that we see in the scientific method as articulated by these authors. For one thing, they're done in laboratories primarily, so you can control all the variables. That's the benefit of doing work in a laboratory, is you can control everything. And so you put everything under very standardized, controlled conditions, and then you pick one variable that you systematically vary in different ways to see how that affects the system that you're studying and how that affects sort of the outcome of your experiments. And you can repeat it over and over and over again in pretty much exactly the same way to try to get as close as possible the exact same results over and over again so that you can have very high confidence that your results are reliable and the knowledge that you're gaining through your experimentation is reliable. The problem, of course, is that some areas of scientific investigation do not lend themselves to that kind of laboratory science. So, up here I've got in parentheses examples like psychology and sociology. You can't control the variables of an individual human mind or control everything that's going on in a whole society and then pick one variable to systematically change in these very precise ways to see how that affects the whole society so that you can get a good sense of the causal influences on this or that thing that's happening in society. You just can't do that, right? There's ethical considerations, but there's also, more importantly, practical considerations. You just can't do it. It's not possible. That's also the case with backward-looking sciences, what Cleland refers to as historical sciences, like geology and paleontology. They're looking at things that have already happened. These layers of sedimentary rock have already been laid down. The tectonic plates have already moved in certain ways, and earthquakes have happened, and mountain ranges have risen up, and so on. These are things that have happened in the distant past, some cases the very distant past, hundreds of millions of years ago or more. And so you can't recreate that in a laboratory. It's too big and it's too complex. You can't systematically control and change the variables and repeat it over and over again. You just can't do that. So, these features of standardized laboratory science that you see in introductory science textbooks as the scientific method, they're just not possible in these other areas of science. And we'll be focusing, of course, on the historical sciences, since that's Carol Cleland's focus in her essay. So things like mass extinctions, we know that the dinosaurs went extinct, right? We look at the fossil record and we see a wide variety of species represented there that aren't there anymore. And further, we have been able to see that many of them, the dinosaurs and a whole bunch of other species that were around at the same time, about 65, 66 million years ago, they just suddenly disappeared. At least geologically speaking, right? They're in one layer of sedimentary rock. We find fossils of these species, and then the layer above that, we don't find them anymore. And so something happened, right? We can't recreate that in a laboratory, and so that kind of laboratory method of science we just can't use. Same thing with moving plates, the plate tectonics, major evolutionary changes that happen in the distant past. We can't recreate that stuff in the laboratory. So with kind of that background in place, we can look at the way that Carol Cleland really starts her essay. And she first talks about this argument from a guy named Henry Gee. Henry Gee was one of the editors of the journal Nature, and that's one of the premier scientific journals in the world. If you get some of your research published in the journal Nature, then that's kind of a career milestone for you. Not very many scientists are able to actually do that. So Henry Gee was a fairly influential person. His opinion, his arguments are going to carry a lot of weight. So he presents this argument. Science must involve controlled experiments, which we already talked about, and logical proof. I talk about this much more in another lecture, the one on Karl Popper's method of falsificationism, where he believes that he's got a scientific method. In fact, he thinks he's got the scientific method, where you can systematically, deductively, logically prove that certain things are false. That's why he calls it falsificationism. So he thinks that he's coming to conclusions that are supported by deductively sound arguments. So if you have a conclusion that's supported by a deductively sound argument, then that means you've proven your argument, your conclusion to be correct. You're 100% guaranteed that it's correct. There's no possibility of it being false. So this is what Henry Gee has in mind when he says that proper science should involve logical proof for its conclusions. Now, of course, these historical fields of study like geology and paleontology, they can't do controlled experiments in the way that physics and chemistry can. And they can't involve logical proof. If you're looking at something that's happened hundreds of millions of years ago, you can gather evidence. So the idea is you can gather evidence in favor of it. But the thought is you can never really be completely sure that what you think happened is what actually happened. So you can't logically prove your conclusions. So therefore, says Henry Gee, those historical fields of study do not qualify as proper science. They're just not real sciences. I'm not sure what we should call them if not sciences, but the idea is that the real sciences, right? Physics, chemistry, certain areas of the life sciences like biochemistry, molecular biology, maybe cellular biology, microbiology, things that are done in a laboratory. These things count as real science. These other fields, the historical, the backwards looking ones, but then also things like sociology, psychology, and some of these others, you can't do the same kinds of controlled experiments. You can't support your conclusions with logical, deductively sound arguments. So therefore, these other fields, they just don't qualify as real science in the same way. Now, if you've looked at the lecture on Karl Popper's method of falsificationism, you could maybe anticipate what Carol Cleland is going to say about that one. So let's take a look. It turns out that Karl Popper's method of falsificationism really still did not count as deductively sound. You can maybe gather evidence in favor of a conclusion being false, but ultimately there's just no way to prove it in this very, very high way of saying you've 100% guaranteed that you've hit on the correct conclusion that something is false. Or alternatively, you can't provide a deductively sound argument to prove that something about the natural world is definitely true. You know, some scientific conclusion is 100% guaranteed to be true. You can't prove that either. So no sciences, not even physics and chemistry, they don't involve logical proof. So going back to Guy's argument here, if in order to qualify as a proper science, your conclusions need to be supported by deductively sound arguments that prove the conclusions, well, then nothing counts as science. You know, if that's the standard we need to meet, well, then nothing can meet that standard, so nothing counts as science. And that's a little silly. Now, the other point, that proper science needs to involve controlled experimentation, that's going to involve a little more work for Cleland. She needs to provide some kind of at least rough and ready method that historical science is following that's at least as reliable as the experimental science method. And so that's where a lot of the rest of her essay goes. So she's going to argue that, yes, the methods that are used in historical science are different, and they might not match what we find in the opening chapters of an introductory science textbook, but nevertheless, even though they're different, they're still reliable. They're not worse. They don't make that field of research fail to qualify as proper science. Okay. She then spends some time in the middle of her essay talking about this kind of general difference between experimental sciences and historical sciences, where the experimental sciences, you know, they control all these details to make a prediction about something that's going to happen in the near future, whereas historical sciences look at a lot of details that are around and available to us today to try to make an inference about something that's happened in the past. We're not going to really directly talk about that too much. We certainly can talk about that in class, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. I'm going to jump right to her proposed method for historical science. And as we'll see, and she makes this clear in her essay, that this method is something that's very similar, at least analogous to what goes on in crime scene investigations. And you've probably all seen the wide variety of TV shows, whether it's CSI itself or NCIS or Law and Order. They kind of all follow the same basic pattern of, you know, we find some major crime that happened. It was an assault, or very frequently it was a murder. And then the crime scene investigators need to figure out what happened. So that's going to be very similar to what's going on here. So that's step one, is find some major event from distant history. I mentioned the mass extinction that involved the dinosaurs. That's a major event that, you know, going way back many, many decades ago, it was clear that something happened a long time ago that caused the extinction of a wide variety of these species that we see in the fossil record and just aren't around anymore. Or we can see that the tectonic plates have moved on the crust of the Earth in some way and caused various earthquakes or volcanoes or whatnot. And we want to look at exactly how that played out, you know, how different mountain ranges were built up or something. And so we want to sort of recreate, provide a full explanation for what's happened with this plate tectonics. Or some speciation event happen, right? That's when new species emerge from previous species. For example, it's thought now that birds emerged from dinosaurs. And so how did that play out? Why did it happen? What was so evolutionarily advantageous of developing feathers and wings and the other characteristics that we associate with birds that allowed for the success of this new branch on the evolutionary family tree? So we find some major thing that happened that draws our attention. In the crime scene example I already mentioned, you know, a standard thing is a dead body is found. It's like, okay, this thing happened that we need to figure out what it was. And so that's focusing our attention. Then in step two, we develop multiple competing hypotheses or causal explanations for what happened to account for this major historical event that we're interested in. And this is different now from experimental science, where typically you're starting, when you're focusing on some particular experiment in a laboratory, you're testing a single hypothesis. You've got a hypothesis about what's happening, and you're testing to see if you're correct or not about that. You don't have usually you don't have multiple competing hypotheses, and you're trying to just sort of figure out which one is more likely to be correct. Instead, you're focusing on a single hypothesis and trying to test that one. Certainly, that's the way some of these classic authors like Karl Popper addressed this, that you're testing a single hypothesis at a time. Well, Cleland's suggesting here that in historical science, you start out with multiple different hypotheses to try to account for what happened in the distant past. In the crime scene example, this would be different suspects, right? Different people, maybe different weapons that could have been used, different motivations, and certainly different people that could have committed this crime. And so that's how it kind of all starts out. Now, since they don't really know for sure which hypothesis is going to be the one that's going to draw the most attention, be the one that turns out to be most likely to be true, they don't have specific evidence, one kind of evidence that they're really focusing on. So they will go to the crime scene, right, the place where this happened, and gather just sort of everything in the whole area. So in the crime scene example, they might have some things in mind that they're going to look for, like fingerprints or blood or DNA samples, hair samples, footprints, or something like that. But they don't know for sure what's really going to be the key pieces of evidence that's going to solve the case. So they'll just collect everything, right? They'll just sweep the whole area, gather up any pieces of trash, go into dumpsters nearby, trash cans and so on, just gather it all, just everything. And a lot of that will end up being irrelevant, but some of it might end up being the key bits of evidence that really break the case. So you gather all this evidence, you might bring some of that back into a laboratory to examine it more closely, but you're not really doing experiments in the way that typical experimental scientists do. Instead, you're just examining this evidence to see how this evidence lines up with your multiple competing hypotheses. It might show you, once you've gathered and examined this evidence, that some of your suspects are just very unlikely to be the ones who did it. Their fingerprints don't match the fingerprints found at the crime scene. Their blood or their DNA or whatever doesn't match what was found at the crime scene. So they're very unlikely to be the ones who did it, the one who did it. Whereas other suspects, they might have the same blood type as what was collected from the crime scene, the same hair as what was collected from the crime scene. And so it makes it more likely that that suspect is the one who did it. So similar thing goes on in paleontology and geology. They go out into the field, collect all the different kinds of rocks and fossils and so on that they can find, and examine that evidence as closely as they can to see how it lines up with their different competing hypotheses. Hopefully, they'll be able to find some evidence, some subset of the evidence that you've gathered that makes it very clear that one of your competing hypotheses, one of your explanations, is the one that's most likely to be correct. So hopefully your evidence is consistent with one explanation, but not with the others. She also talks about in her essay, Cleland does, that we hope to be able to find what's called a smoking gun piece of evidence that makes it extremely clear. It kind of closes the case, right? That makes it extremely clear that one of your hypotheses is the one that's really the correct one. In the crime scene example, kind of the silly scenario here is you come into the room, you see a dead body, and so it's like, some major event just happened in the near history, right? Somebody was killed. There's different people in the room, so you've got competing hypotheses. It could be one of these 5 people. But then it turns out that one of those people is holding a gun that's pointed towards the dead body, and there's smoke coming out of the gun. It's like, okay, I think that was the person that committed the murder, right? The one that's holding the smoking gun. And so, that's kind of the silly example of how there could be one bit of evidence that makes it overwhelmingly obvious that one of your competing hypotheses is the one that's correct, and the other ones are very unlikely to be correct. And what's going on here is what's described in step 5 here, inference to the best explanation. You're not proving something to be 100% guaranteed to be true, or logically proving that you've got the best explanation. Instead, you're providing evidence in favor of your explanation. And so the take-home message ultimately here, even though Cleland was sort of outlining these differences between experimental and historical science and making the case that historical science can give us very reliable knowledge. In fact, nowadays, it's thought to be pretty reliable that we know what happened to the dinosaurs. We know why they went extinct. The paleontologists and the geologists went out there and they did the work, they gathered the evidence, and they showed that some of the competing hypotheses are very unlikely to be correct, whereas one of the hypotheses was probably the thing that did it, the thing that caused them to go extinct. But ultimately, the moral of the story is that there really is not one method that is the scientific method, such that if you're not doing that, you're not doing science. Rather, science allows for lots of different methods, lots of different techniques, and ultimately, the goal is to do your work well enough that you can convince the rest of the scientific community, right? You can convince your scientific peers that what your conclusions are good conclusions, that they can't really think of any reasons why your conclusions would be wrong. If you're following kind of the standardized laboratory technique methods, fine. If you're following kind of these historical science techniques or any other area of science, as long as you're providing reasons in favor of your conclusions that are convincing to the rest of the scientific community, then you're doing science. You're being a scientist. So we can certainly talk about a variety of examples in class, but that's Cleland's argument overall.